Part 1. Addressing the counter-arguments of pronoun selection. First, I should state, I am autistic, get absurdly rumbly, and am generally not great at formulating a solid essay without drinking 5 coffees and having my best friend there to yell at me about repetitive word and paragraph use and the virtues of conciseness. Despite this, I am determined to put something out there, and hopefully some of you who don't write like you're having a stroke on your keyboard can turn this into better arguments and discussions. Love you all. I want to begin this by acknowledging the other side of this argument. As a trans man who doesn't always pass for masculine and has a feminine voice, I've spent my entire life being subject to misogyny, vitriol, and sexual harassment, especially in the gaming sphere. I can't count the amount of online games I've had to stay mute on out of fear of being outed as a fab, assigned female at birth, and thus being subject to endless threats and disturbing statements from cisgender men. I'm certain that most of you reading this who play other video games have also had a similar experience, if not plenty. I specifically recall being harassed in games like Minecraft by adult men even back when I was only 10 or 11. As a SAR survivor, I'm also keenly aware of the trauma we carry as a fab gamers, cis women, trans men, and non-binary people alike, related to the way we have been treated in gaming and in real life by cisgender men. I acknowledge this because when I read comments defending female player-only SSO, many of those comments are steeped in fear of losing a safe space before anything else. Yes, arguments about the law do come up, but especially with the modern games law and handling of a gender-bent concord, I see that much less frequently as it's become a more moot argument even from the dev team's perspective. And while I will be covering how such a gender-centric plotline can be damaging both to women and other genders, I feel that most of us have moved beyond discussion of old plot directions and now focus more on the maintaining of safe spaces for female gamers. I wholly understand the fear of inviting men, especially cisgender, heterosexual men, into a traditionally feminine space that has for years provided many women and girls alike a way to enjoy gaming without feeling the danger many other games involving men provide. In fact, I think it's the most solid argument in the case of keeping SSO female player only. But I think we need to understand why such a belief is now very outdated, and actually holds us back from making progress for fab gamers. It's important to understand that when gaming first became more mainstream, it was almost exclusively targeted towards young boys, as the console and early PC markets believed this to be the most lucrative demographic. This enforced the idea early on that gaming was a gendered activity, which meant women and girls were often discouraged or at least not encouraged to partake in online gaming when it began to become popular. And because this resulted in so few fab people taking part in online gaming, these stereotypes were further reinforced in the minds of the boys playing online. For years until very recently, it's been a circular process of sexism. Fab people are not marketed to online, so they do not play online, so only cis men play online, so those men believe women don't game. So when an fab person tries to game, they are shamed or harassed, so fab people quit and avoid online gaming. So the markets view them as an unmarketable to demographic. The cycle repeats. It's equally important to understand that a similar cycle has long since plagued the equestrian community, but in the opposite direction. While once equestrian sports were a man's activity, by the early 1990s the pendulum had swung in the exact opposite direction. Working class girls and women were encouraged and supported in equestrianism, while the lifestyle and hobby was almost never recommended to working class boys and men. Soon, a man taking part in these activities was seen as feminine in a negative manner, and to this day men, cis and trans alike, are shamed for being horse boys, called predatory or gross for enjoying a woman's hobby of horses, and are often kept out of anything equine related. Games about horses, especially, have for a very long time refused to engage with a male audience at all, asserting that the boys who do have the courage to express their interest in horses shouldn't like them, and that men should not be allowed into feminine hobbies. Both of these unfortunate cycles promote both misogyny and misandry. Once you understand their implications, horses being a girl's interest while action and online games being for boys asserts that horses are inherently feminine, and that girls must inherently be interested in them, but not in online games or shooters, because a girl cannot or should not possess traditionally masculine interests unless she is in some way odd. At the same time, this asserts that boys are to be inherently interested in only traditionally masculine interests. and for a man to be interested in anything for women means he must either secretly be preying on women, or he is inherently feminine and broken. As you can see, this enforces gender roles on both genders, and shames both for stepping out of said roles. It continues the age-old belief that to be feminine is a negative trait, while being masculine is a positive trait women are not allowed to have. In the last 5 or so years, we've seen a lot of massive steps in the gaming industry to try and open online gaming and offline gaming up to FAB players. We've seen massive influxes in female main characters in offline, story-driven games, and despite an often disturbing response from the Gamergate crowds, these games have proven that there is a definite audience willing to pay for games with strong female protagonists. Perhaps the most welcoming change for FAB gamers, though, is the popularity of MMOs. Massively multiplayer online role-playing games, the category which SSO falls into. MMOs have, since nearly the dawn of their popularity, allowed for gamers to make their own main characters, and almost every single MMO, and all of the popular ones, has allowed for players to choose between a female or male character to play as, to ensure players can create themselves or their characters to properly represent themselves in-game. Much of the character creation we are now awarded in modern gaming stems from old-school RPGs and MMOs, and this massive step in the right direction has allowed for FAB gamers to finally represent themselves in a game. Just the ability to choose to play as a female character is an immediate sign of welcoming for FAB players online. It's a sign that the game devs perceive their game to be one that is playable by women and men alike, and that seemingly small choice alone can be incredibly empowering for once ignored audiences. Now let's examine SSO's MMO strategy. The game only allows for female player characters, which immediately asserts that the plotline and world are built only for a woman to exist as the main character. The exact thing that older men-only games did to enforce anti-female player stereotypes, intentionally or not, but reversed. While the dev team may say that men are allowed to play the game, this would be the equivalent of another large MMO, for instance Red Dead Online, to only allow male characters but claim women could still play as long as they made their protagonist male, especially in a MMO, where only one gender being playable is nearly unheard of due to being exclusionary. You can see the huge problem here. Despite stating men can play the game, the developers are making a clear statement that they can't play it as themselves, which would be alright in a single-player game, but not in a game where the woman players can and are encouraged to play as themselves. Men being allowed to play isn't the same as men being welcome to play, just as many online shooter games allowed women to play, but never represented them or welcomed them to. And we all know that leads to a sense of exclusion which, over time, contributes to sexist attitudes towards who isn't or is allowed in a gaming sphere. While SSO may have had good intentions developing a game for women to have a safe space, this choice doesn't only further contribute to stereotypes of many not being welcome in equestrian communities, it also contributes to the stereotype that horses are girly, feminine, and that women need their gaming safe spaces to focus on stereotypically girly themes, rather than other genres. But most of all, it contributes to something much more sinister. It falls into the separate but equal line of thinking, in which rather than fighting to make every game an equal space for all genders by forcing mainstream online gaming companies to open their representation up to FAB people in positive ways, it makes the statement that the only way for a girl to be represented in gaming is to have her own, separate game devoid of men, and to stay away from traditionally masculine games. This doesn't do anything but help to keep the cycle of keeping women out of mainstream gaming alive. The more women playing woman-targeted only games, the fewer playing men-targeted only games, when our goal as feminists and equal rights activists should be to eliminate the idea of gender-targeted gaming itself, so that women can safely engage in any game they want to and be welcomed by their fellow male gamers, and vice versa. Remember, equality isn't won through exclusion or segregation based on stereotypes for safety. It's won through leading the world to become safe for us all, no matter where we choose to exist in it. When we play into stereotypes and try to make an exclusive game to combat all the others out there, we only further encourage division and a lack of representation in other games. Leading by example is an integral part of ensuring equality for future gaming. Hopefully I've convinced you well enough that the idea of an MMO that only focuses on a woman protagonist and only allows women to represent themselves correctly is very harmful to our fight for equality as a FAB people in an MMO gaming sphere, and that to achieve gender equality we have to dismantle old stereotypes and move past old gaming practices rather than play into them. Now, I know the second most common argument is that allowing boys to play as themselves in this game would lead to pretend dating and sexual harassment, and I'm going to be honest, I find this argument steeped in a lot of sexism and once again reinforcing traditional values rather than attempting to dismantle them. I'll be short here. SSO already has boys dressing as boyishly as possible, and SSO already has sexual harassment and pretend dating, so does basically every other youth MIP. I grew up on Animal Jam and Club Penguin, which both had gender choice, which included both girls and boys positively, but also both had dating and occasional sexual harassment, and I'm sure some predation. But, to be clear, these games had only as much as SSO does currently, clearly not affected by allowing boys to play. For one, most players of these games, SSO included, are kids. Little boys are not thinking about harassing girls, or dating. They're thinking about the exact same fun things little girls are. And hey, if someone is being disturbing, games have report buttons for a reason. Seriously, Animal Jam, Club Penguin, and a plethora of other children's MIPs have had a gender choice since creation, and all of them stood the test of time, felt very inclusive, and did not suffer from any more weirdness than SSO does currently. Also, women can be creepy and predatory too. As we have found out recently, female SSO players have actually been harassing a lot of male SSO players sexually and in various upsetting ways. And even without male characters, it's pretty common to still see girls pretending to be guys for their role plays, etc. This is something kids seem to do regardless of a gender option or who is playing. Again, if someone is a creep, the answer is to report them, not to generalize an entire category of people and exclude them from a game. It's cruel to treat people, especially the player base of children, as though their gender define their creepiness, or to imply that girls and boys cannot play games together without things going sexual or romantic. Again, it's an old, sexist set of stereotypes that act as though boys and girls should not be allowed around each other and cannot be friends. That's all I will say on that issue, because I find it to be a pretty disturbing take from the dev team and a very conservative worldview regarding hetero-platonic relationships. It's argument enough to understand every other kid's MIP allows for gender choice, and many have even less harassment than we see in SSO. As for the storyline argument of Broken Bar, I think we all kind of know how silly that is. The devs barely follow their own world building and are almost never consistent with lore and plot lines, and old themes and messages from the beginning of the game are barely present, if at all, nowadays. I've actually played all of the Starshine Legacy games, and it's an understatement to say everything from lore to theme has changed drastically since then, to the point where SSO is barely in the same series as its predecessors. If the dev team can change every other part of the plotline, they can also change the gendered part, even discounting the fact that it's frankly kind of weird and essentialist to imply that magic in SSO's universe is in some ways entirely limited to whether you're a girl or not, and that such an emphasis used to be put on a weirdly cosmically forced sisterhood. We recently got an entire plotline where Concord turned out to be reincarnated as a filly, when all other recorded soul steeds have been stallions. Considering these soul steeds are sentient enough to talk, and have the same kind of magic our main characters do, it's logical to believe that the druids were wrong about gender reincarnation, and the reality is that any of these soul folk can reincarnate into any sex, which suggests anyone of any gender and any body type could be a soul rider, soul steed. It's a cool new thing from the devs that in my opinion really helps to make the plotline feel more inclusive and less steeped in old stereotypes about horse girls, but it also completely backs the idea of introducing new player bodies and pronouns. Even if you want to disregard that huge chunk of new lore, the case now is that this game has been changing so much that it absolutely can change to be gender inclusive without breaking its lore any more than every big update already does. Due to Concord, the law could even state directly that every previous soul rider has been female-bodied and cisgender, but that's just more common, not set in stone. I actually think that kind of logic would allow for non-girl players to feel like their being rare in equestrian communities is being acknowledged and represented in a positive, encouraging light. To the final argument of how it'd be difficult to code this stuff in a Broken Bar, really doubt that. A lot of this would require some fairly simple if-then coding where pronouns would be automatically replaced in dialogue, but a vast majority of dialogue wouldn't even need manual changing at all. Male players don't need a totally different plotline to play, nor do they need to be treated any differently by all existing NPCs. In fact, It's better if all players experience the same world and plots in the same way. So this is quite literally just a case of programming some code to automatically change dialogue pronouns using a player character tag on some words. It's something done very easily by indie developers with ancient programs, and can definitely be achieved by the team. As for bodies, male characters can have the same bone structures and general meshing as female characters. In fact, we really don't even need a gendered body at all. Why not simply include a second line of body shapes with less hip and flat chests? Many games do that nowadays and rely on the pronoun choice to determine gender rather than body shape, and that's both an easier solution and more progressive than building a whole new set of assets. Seriously, all SSE has to do here is develop some basic gender coding, rewrite a few lines of sisterhood dialogue, and include a version of the character body with a flatter chest without redoing any animations or bone work. That itself would be more than enough and immediately result in a great amount of inclusivity. Part 2. Why we need pronoun selection. Congrats! You've survived my rambling long enough to get to the arguments in favor of adding player pronouns and body selection to the game. I'm going to try my hardest not to address arguments I've made above. The first and most general argument is simply to allow players more story and character choice. Most of us either make ourselves, or create a knock in the game. Either way, having a choice of pronoun and body shape would allow for much more player accuracy as well as more diverse characters like some of the NPCs we see. Allowing players to choose their gender would also make this game very welcoming to boys, especially younger boys, and encourage them to feel at home in the equestrian community from an early, or later, age. With all the discouragement and lack of male representation in the lower, non-wealthy echelons of equestrian sport and lifestyle, this would be great. Not only would this simple change dismantle stereotypes about boys not being able to like horses the way girls do, but it'd also dismantle the horse-girl stereotype. Making horses an everyone thing on the world's most popular equine game would make massive waves for equestrians and gamers alike. Plus, letting this game finally escape the trap of being viewed as a girl game would allow it to be taken much more seriously by new players and male gamers, and would contribute to the idea that horse games are for everyone, and games in general are genderless products. Allowing boys, and others, to comfortably see themselves in a game like this, even if they still chose to play as a female character, means a heck of a difference, both ensuring young boys will grow up feeling like horses are for everyone, and thus they will grow up to stand against gendered activities and equestrian gatekeeping, and that older boys who may now be jaded have a chance of embracing a hobby they may have kept hidden out of societal shame until now. Seriously, just giving people this small of a thing makes a giant difference in how we societally view certain hobbies and interests. We Fab people know this because many of us found gaming through games that allowed us to portray ourselves. SSO opening itself up to more gender portrayals would make it a trailblazer game and would give it some really good press as well, considering the team likes to view themselves as a progressive or inclusive company. This would prove it and paint them, truthfully, as one of the first mainstream equestrian games to show that horses are for everyone, and that horse girl is a nonsense, sexist insult because girls who love horses are actually just a broken bar people who like horses a lot, who come in all flavors. Now, I'm biased here, as a trans guy, but I feel one of the largest reasons to add pronoun selection at the very least, and body choice with pronouns at the most, is for LGBT players. All of us know there's a very large LGBT community around this game, and a massive portion of that section are trans boys, and non-binary folk. Many of them who grew up on this game first playing as girls only to realize they weren't long after beginning their journeys on Jorvik. Even outside of SSO, many trans men and non-binary Fab people grew up around horses because they were seen as women and thus encouraged to, and have a love for them that still burns strong today. Many of them likely have not tried SSO because on first login they realized they were going to have to pretend to be a girl in-game, and look at traits that made them dysphoric. And for a lot of us that kind of pretending and those looks are why we stopped engaging in equestrianism in real life. That's a major breaking point to many LGBT players who otherwise would find SSO to be a perfect game for them. Many of us have severe dysphoria and even gendered shame around liking horses in our pasts, due to the same stereotypes SSO's current systems encourage, and are immediately driven away from SSO because it only stands now to further make us feel those things about ourselves, and makes those feelings and stereotypes feel all the more real. Personally, I quit riding when I was a little kid because I felt uncomfortable being seen as girly by all the people around me, and I convinced myself I hated horses because when I was around them I felt like the whole world would think there was no way I could be a boy who loved horses. I came around to them by playing Red Dead Redemption 2 online with my other trans friends. Being able to make myself a man and still admire all my pretty ponies, care for them, change their hairs, dress myself up for rides, etc., completely changed how I felt and my shame. Suddenly I was able to see myself and understand that horses really could be for people like me and that I didn't have to feel dysphoric for loving them. I went on a real life trail ride, got hooked, and now I've been riding for a few years and am going into hunter jumper, and found a supportive and inclusive stable that likes me for who I am without trying to convince me I'm secretly a girl for loving what I love. When I came to SSO I got into it for the plot and lore along with the horses, but I felt deeply dysphoric and unwelcome in the game by the gender choice. Seeing my character look like me but feminine sent horrible dysphoria through me, and it only started to subside when I unlocked short hairs and the sweaters that kept my character's chest down. Even now I still get massive dysphoria spikes when I'm misgendered in game, and despite how far I've come against all the stereotypes about equestrianism, SSO enforces them more heavily. And sometimes I do feel ashamed for loving the game when I know it thinks I have to be a girl character to belong in it properly. It's the same feeling I had to grow up with all my life about everything feminine, and it's really upsetting, sexist to both men and women, and dysphoria-inducing. Even if we only had pronouns in the game, I and most trans masculine and non-binary players would probably be perfectly satisfied. I'd be totally okay with a little bit of bust or hips if every time I spoke to NPCs they validated my character rather than misgendering me. Just an allowance for changing pronouns and names would be enough to let trans players feel seen and respected in this game. When now I know many of us feel like the game is telling us the only way we can play it is if we essentially detransition our characters while playing. It may not seem this way to cis players, but for those of us who are queer and have dysphoria, and even many of those who are queer but don't, being forced to play a female character is something we've done all our lives, especially around equestrianism and other traditionally feminine spaces, and it really does hurt terribly to have to continue that trend in a game that claims to be inclusive. Why can I dress my horse in transgender pride flags that clearly imply I am trans? But still when I talk to NPCs all I'm allowed to be is a cis-looking woman. It feels a lot like rainbow capitalism right now, a very hollow and fake kind of representation that doesn't actually do all that much for players who need to feel more supported for who they are, not for who they have to pretend to be. We can pick our horse's sex, but not our player's gender, and man, it really feels like a huge portion of the player base who are LGBT are seen as expendable and not worth pandering to, unlike the cisgender female side of the player base, and it just continues to fuel this sense of exclusivity in horse games and hatred towards masc and non-binary people in the equestrian world. Trans men are allowed to play our game as long as they accept a lot of dysphoria and that their hobby is a girl's hobby they have to pretend to be a girl to partake in is not including trans players or guys. It is exclusion and a lack of empathy thinly veiled as a nice steak. Currently, many of you may notice that on a lot of large SSO-related social media accounts, and even on the main channels, bigotry against LGBT players and misandry against boys is on the rise. Most boys and trans players now have at least one story to tell of how they were harassed either in-game or on popular social media affiliated with SSO. Almost any of us who try to talk about pronoun additions or body additions are near immediately blasted with everything from threats, to horrible insults, to vitriolic comments. And for those of us who are queer, most of those commenters begin with seemingly innocuous arguments, only to eventually begin purposefully misgendering us, calling trans people and boys groomers, and harassing us based on our LGBT status. It has become quite clear that in this argument, many of the arguments from cisgender, heterosexual girls against male and NB pronoun additions are steeped in a lot of bigotry, and because SSO takes a stance of this game being for girls and about girls, whether they say it like that or not, hopefully I've done a solid job proving to you how it spreads only those messages. They indirectly encourage these people to behave this way, and are indirectly taking that side of the argument which promotes really disturbing responses to boys, especially LGBT boys. Now, I've also personally noticed a slow shift in a lot of girl players who are now beginning to support the idea of pronouns in-game. To all of you, you're awesome allies. and thank you for standing up for this issue that may feel unserious to a lot of women but is very serious for a lot of queer and masculine players. I hope you guys are equally stood up for another gaming spheres dominated by men, and that we can help one another out and find equality and respect in gaming together. I do see more cis women beginning to recognize how harmful to trans people this kind of game design can be in MMOG. And again, I'm thankful for that open-mindedness and I'm hoping to encourage more of that here. But in reaction to that and to us standing up for equality in gaming, there has been so much vitriol towards queer and masc players that many of us are struggling to remain on SSO, which is what these more bigoted players disguising said bigotry in odd criticism want from us, because the game itself combined with its currently quite toxic and bigoted fanbase causes us an incredible amount of stress. No matter how much we love it and want to stay for the horses and plot, I'm hoping this may encourage some of you to rethink your biases and your positions and decide to stand up with us against these toxic sides of the fanbase, and prove that bigotry and sexism will never have a place in SSO. Even if you still disagree with adding pronouns for the players, which I hope I've changed your mind on with these arguments, it would still mean a lot to many of us if more people stood up to the bigots using this issue as a way to more subtly be transphobic, homophobic, and sexist to all genders involved. It's become a really harmful thing for the LGBT side of this game, and I think we'd all be thankful if more care was placed on the level of hatred we receive just for existing on this game at all. Now, feel free to stop reading here. I'm hopeful I could change someone's mind on this topic or even just one of the arguments, or give someone who already agrees with my position a new argument in favor of it. And I'd be happy to have civil, non-bigoted conversations with anyone willing to discuss this topic, from concerns to how the implementation could work. The part below this is going to take a bit of a sudden shift, and will have some slightly spicy accusations towards SSO YouTubers, especially in this case Denise Wisestorm, on their handling of this argument and the harm they've done for this movement for LGBT players. Hopefully it'll help some of these people to understand how their arguments for male player characters can sometimes be steeped in homophobia, transphobia, and misogyny, and how that might be causing some female and LGBT players to begin associating the movement for pronouns and player bodies with the same bigotry we face on the other side of the issue. Part 3, Denise Wisestorm, or how to support the right cause and still make it homophobic. One thing I know about the SSO community is that we all have a vast variety of differing opinions on the SSO YouTuber, Denise Wisestorm. Many people on this sub absolutely loathe his content, while others love him. It might shock you after reading that header to know I find myself right in the center. I firmly believe that despite negativity not being great to be around, sometimes it can help a game to change, and Dennis and his fans have had an impact on the game, whether some want to admit it or not. The negativity can be tiring, yes, but to have a big influencer in the player base actively criticizing the game can actually lead to the dev team listening to issues they otherwise would never see, and can mobilize a lot of people to contact the dev team in nicer manners, too. While it can obviously create opposition, it can also be a force for good despite being a very pessimistic one. I think Dennis' kind of critique has a valid place in the fan base, and that it can be really helpful. My negatives with Dennis come largely from him being often unwilling to praise correct moves from the devs, which creates confusion for a game team trying to listen to what the influencers want, and, largely, from his homophobia, which I'll be discussing, and backing up, here. I also would like to make it clear that while this will seem like a call-out post directly aimed at Dennis, this is something very rampant in the SSO community as a whole, and I don't want to solely pin this on him. I also want to acknowledge that while his past apology for intense homophobia was partially an excuse, it also did seem genuine, and where we're born and how we are raised can make us say naive and bigoted things without us recognizing them. While I don't think that excuse covers the entirety of how he acts, I do think it's a valid reason for not quite knowing how to interact with or discuss LGBT issues. And if he learns from this kind of stuff, I don't want people going after him. People make mistakes, they say silly things, and they get looped into dumb ideologies all the time. It's bad when they never try to change, but we have to be kind and accept when they do, and try not to assume the worst of them based off of what we see. I'll be covering a recent video of Dennis here, related directly to how SSO has been excluding guys from its content in various ways, from the player bodies to how it handles its social media, and is indirectly contributing to an outburst of vitriol and hatred from its community. I actually agree with a lot of the video and think that without its underlying homophobia and transphobia, it makes some good points that a lot of the community needs to hear. I just wish it had been made not with bigotry but with inclusion of men and non-binary who are LGBT and receiving all the same treatment. I also want to make sure it's understood that bigotry can be direct or indirect, but what I'm going over here is quite direct. If Dennis just wasn't mentioning trans guys being harassed to insane degrees or gay guys being shamed in-game, I'd take a different approach here. But to be clear, the video includes some very poorly hidden outright talking points and directly associates being LGBT with being entitled / whiny / annoying and a wrong thing to be. I'm gonna talk about some key points in this video and try to explain how they are pretty harmful to views, especially those of kids who watch his stuff, to LGBT people, and then we'll discuss how espousing these things actually weakens the real and valid arguments he is making here. While I have watched the full video, I really do not want to watch it again, as it's pretty upsetting to hear as a trans and bi guy. Because of this I won't be making direct quotes, but I did take some notes of what I caught in this video, and hopefully those of you who want to can go through the video and corroborate these things yourself. Here's the video, for proof of this stuff. https://www.youtube.com/watch v=bmc8ocbkr_channel Denise Wisestorm. I also just want to get it right out of the way so that I don't have to try and argue certain points, and so that we do not have to come back to it. A few years back, Dennis was very openly homophobic to another lovely SSO YouTuber over DMs. These were posted and Dennis did confirm their validity and then apologize, partially in an excuse but also in a manner that to me came off as emotionally honest. While I do think he really has probably changed his mind on what he said here, and I do not want people going at him for something he's already apologized for and said he was wrong about point blank, I do think this needs to be here as it suggests some very deep level of homophobia that helps to explain the more subtle things in the above video. The person being talked about is an old SSO content creator now known for being an open pedophile and confirmed child groomer, openly racist, an outright extremist, and very bigoted and racist on other fronts, which was I believe pretty much known by a lot of these people already. That said, I don't want to assume Dennis was close to her or ever interacted with her or knew about the pedophilia, grooming, though it'd be impossible not to be aware of her saying the N-word and outright stuff. Either way, what he's defending here is just her homophobia, but I want to make it clear how horrible of a person she was. Trigger warning for some pretty nasty homophobia. https://www.tumblr.com/sickeristolian/1769354877744/daily reminder. Right, now that that's out of the way, we can cover the actual video. I'm going to spew out my major gripes with it. Again, please try to take all these in the most charitable light possible, but also understand the context behind knowing Dennis has had some related incorrect views before. I think something we transmasc people are beginning to see is that many of the people on the face of this positive movement asking for change to be made for inclusivity, in this case Denise Wisestorm, have been heavy-handedly distinguishing between straight male players and queer players in this ongoing conversation. More specifically, I've noticed that his videos covering this topic will often refer to straight, cisgender men as the real male players who need to be listened to and accommodated, and will refer to gay male players as fundamentally more feminine and similar to female players, not facing the issues straight male players do, which just isn't the case, and relies on very old stereotypes about gay men being womanly and not real, masculine men. Notably, he and his fanbase often make comments like, "I'm a guy who plays and all the girls in the game think I'm gay or trans. It sucks and I feel like less of a man because of it," further suggesting that in the eyes of these communities, being gay is an inherently shameful, feminizing, or otherwise bad thing, and that femininity in men is terrible. Many comments have, in my personal opinion, the correct opinion that SSO needs to become pronoun inclusive and allow for masculine body types, but I believe they hold many incorrect and homophobic opinions over gay identities and often use homophobia to defend this movement, and this movement to defend homophobia, which is a massive bummer because the movement is so important to many trans masculine and non-binary players. Furthermore, I have noticed that he does not pin, heart, or listen to any voices from transgender men and masculine non-binary people specifically, while frequently hearting and engaging with all comments around them from cis straight people. Comments discussing transgender identity are typically entirely ignored, and then flooded with bigotry from the fanbase, which is not moderated or discouraged at all by Dennis. This could obviously be a product of ignorance or sheer chance, but I do think that there is a very visible disparity between the support for heterosexual cisgender male comments and the complete lack of any for those men who are LGBT, especially transgender. I may be a bit jaded, but it does come off to me as though Dennis might not believe trans people exist or that trans men are real men. This is corroborated by his most recent video discussing the hate male players get, where as far as I am aware he does not cover the specific and often more specific and targeted bigotry trans men face from cishet players lately. He also specifically has a segment complaining about wokeness and how the equality he's advocating for in-game is different from woke ideals. And maybe I've just been an analog person on the internet too long, but to me much of the wording that came off is at least inadvertently implying that LGBT men are woke and whine about fake things while only the cisgender, hetero men are having real problems and should be listened to about these issues. He also states in the video that the people who proclaim love is love and obsessing over gender orientation and skin color are the same people trying to block straight men like him from the game, which is not only incorrect. Most of us who are LGBT are the most desperate to have male pronouns, for obvious dysphoric reasons, but is also clearly quite a bigoted take steep in viewing LGBT people as the enemy even when we fight for the same things as him. This is perhaps reach, but he also uses terms like clown world in the video, which are most commonly used by the far right. I am a leftist and have heard the terms be used by other leftists as well. But combined with how he uses woke and other terms, I think it is much more likely that this is an instance of using a right-wing word most often directly related to the disbelief in the existence of LGBT people. He actually goes on a rant in this video where he directly equates LGBT people to his use of the term wokeness and then says he's against said wokeness, and then gets pretty aggressive about that. He acts like he's contrarian about this, but I have to admit, especially knowing his past comments, I actually think this behavior may be more disturbing than his old comments for how it's both snuck in and also villainizes LGBT people and purposefully disregards our opinions on this issue as whining and invalid because of our queerness, and the level to which he makes it clear that he is viewing this issue as a normal men directly versus LGBT people and woke women becomes quite prominent by the end of the video. To be clear, I support this movement from guys trying to see ourselves represented in the only MMO currently not allowing for gender selection, especially as a trans man who views this from an LGBT rights perspective and believes the team of an MMO needs to be privy to the comfort and needs of their player base, especially when a large portion are trans men who realize their identity as they grew up on this game. However, I find it to be very harmful when the people at the forefront of this positive movement are espousing some pretty transphobic and homophobic viewpoints and even blaming much of this issue on LGBT people when we're actually fighting for the same outcome. I think that it's getting very worrying that you can either be in the group of cisgender, heterosexual women who vehemently hate men and especially LGBT men playing SSO and do not want to see us validated, or in the group of cisgender, heterosexual men who also vehemently hate LGBT men playing SSO and would rather see us their enemies for no reason than stand with us for the same cause. This has provided trans and non-binary masculine players nowhere to safely stand on this issue, or frankly anywhere in SSO's player base, and it continues to worsen as channels like Dennis paint LGBT men as shameful to be and the enemy of the straight male gamer's plight in this game. It's as though no matter where you stand on this matter, you are now expected to loathe trans people and consider them the predatory enemy of progress in the game. The amount of red flags to full-on red banners in the video is quite immense, and I would say that it's not reading between the lines at this point to know his language and interactions with LGBT people are still steeped in bigotry and still aim to make us the enemy, even on a matter where we're fighting for the same goal as him. I'd say this is less dog whistling and more so open bigotry disguised behind an all-bet good, in my opinion, broader cause. I would highly recommend watching the video yourself to understand what I am talking about here, as hearing this stuff directly is, in my opinion, an easier way to detect the tones and suggestions behind it than just reading a vague post. I think most people who watch it will come to a similar conclusion of very yikesy statements and behaviors in it. Regardless of where you stand on the issue of game pronouns and masculine models, I think this is still becoming such a dangerous issue for LGBT players that it is worth looking into and possibly confronting for the sake of trying to create a safer community in SSO for LGBT players. To be forced out of a conversation we very much deserve to have a voice in as people directly affected by pronouns and gender representation, because both sides find us disgusting or invalid for one reason or another is incredibly depressing and is only the beginning of a more vitriolic, anti-queer community's formation, as I've seen forming countless game communities before in a similar fashion. Not only is this kind of content and the comments section under it harmful to LGBT players and in some ways female players alike, but it also makes the movement to add pronouns to the game feel like something fueled by insecure straight guys not wanting to feel feminine, rather than a more complex issue about gaming representation, LGBT rep in MMOs, male rep in equestrianism, and the search for real equality and safety in gaming spaces, not fueled by spite but instead by positivity, which absolutely drives away people who would otherwise agree with all the points being made. I feel, personally, as though videos like this may reach some people, but the audience they reach is one that is closer to Gamergate stuff than to people who want everyone to have a voice in this discussion, and that hopefully most of us do not want to cultivate that kind of player base around this game. Again, this isn't just a Dennis problem. I'd say he's at the forefront of it and has been for a long while, both as one of the main defenders of the male player character idea as well as one of the main sources of some very iffy anti-LGBT sentiment in the community. But others do this, support it, and do not call it out. And at this point these sentiments are all over SSO's social media to a degree where being LGBT is becoming quite stressful in SSO, especially if you're a queer guy or non-binary person. Dennis is a good example of it, but I want to encourage people to not be hateful towards him and to not assume the worst. We all make mistakes and we all say things that come off totally different than how we mean them, but I do think it becomes a bigger issue when it creates communities that are spreading not so accidental bigotry around. And hopefully Dennis becomes more aware of what his words can do in communities. Hopefully you, the reader, understand my perspective on this, even if you disagree. I love having civil and kind conversations over this topic, and about creating safe and inclusive gaming spaces for women and LGBT players in a heterosexual male-dominated gaming world, while not enforcing any old stereotypes that hold us back without our noticing. I also would love to have these convos with data and look at how other games have handled multi-gender selection in their online segments in order to see what we can do to help SSO grow into the best version of itself. I love this game even when it causes me grief, and I know you guys do too. That's why we're all here, and I hope that despite any disagreements you might hold over any part of this, that we can remain civil and stay united over our love of the game and hopes for it to keep getting better. Cheers, from a stupid long-winded queer dude who can't master good paragraph structure.